My family lived in Orange in the central west of New South Wales, and when I left school at 16, my dad took me for a job interview at the local bank. Outside was the sign saying, "Broadcasting station 2GZ, upstairs," and I said that is where I would really like to work. So after a 5-minute interview with the manager, I started the following week in the record library, just doing the general bits and pieces. Eventually, I was allowed to select a record to go on air, and that was very exciting. And they were the old 78 days and the vinyls, and rock and roll was just starting to come in with the first Elvis Presley 45 arrived, and there was great excitement in the record library. I spent 3 years there, and during that time, Lawsy went through. He caused quite a stir in Orange, as you can imagine, as a young hooligan, followed by John Brennan, Big Sam Cronje, Tony Murphy. They all came through 2GZ. 3 years of working in the record library, selecting eventually a complete program, the breakfast I used to do. I then decided I was ready for the big time as well. So I applied for Sydney Radio and I got a job at 2UE. And I was given the unenviable task of looking after Bob Rogers and Tony Withers. And it was quite a task. They were ego maniacs, these two guys. But what I learned in that 3 or 4 years I worked for them was totally invaluable, absolutely wonderful. So as PA to those two and doing a lot of program work as well. John Brennan by this time had decided to go to 2SM in Sydney, and he was program director plus on air. And he rang me, he said, "I think it's time you came over and worked for me." 2SM was down very low on the dial. They changed format. They brought in Mike Walsh, also happened to bring Bob Rogers across. And we went top 40 to the full extent of what you could possibly do. Number 1 in 6 months. So that was a huge achievement for the station. I stayed with them for about 3 or 4 years, and then I decided, I think it's time to see the world. So 3 girlfriends and I boarded the SS Aronsay, and off we went to the UK, arriving there at the end of 1963. And my first job was answering fan mail for Cliff Richards. That was quite funny. He had just been to the United States and had been on one of the major television shows. And the fan mail just was pouring in. They had bags of it and they didn't know what to do with it. So I very quickly learned his signature and sent a lot of cards back, autographed, Cliff Richard. One of my contacts in London was a music publisher. He rang me and told me that an Australian called Alan Crawford was thinking of starting a commercial broadcasting station on a ship in the North Sea to beam into London. So all the Merseyside of pop music was starting up, but nowhere at all could they get local exposure. I haven't had a chat with him, and another Australian girl, Dorothy White, who was the programmer at 2GB in Sydney. We were the only 2 girls in London that had ever programmed a top 40 station. So we were very welcome.
I felt that the BBC monopoly was far too severe a handicap, so of course being an Australian I wanted to change it.
The station's copy is written by Bob Larkin from 7HO Hobart. Ex-Sydney radio man Ken Evans is the program director. Assisting Ken is Marion Cochrane from 2SM in Sydney and Dorothy White from 2GB.
And anything illegal is slightly illegal is very exciting. There's always a surprise element of not knowing what is going to happen next.
On Easter Sunday morning in 1964, when all the politicians were at home with their feet up, Radio Caroline, both north and south, came on the air at 8 o'clock with the Rolling Stones. Not fade away, and that was the message. Not going anywhere, not going to fade away, this was it. And the response was absolutely outstanding. By the end of the week, the audience was within the millions. In fact, by the end of the first month, it was more than the population of Australia. And that just astounded us. We could not believe this. And the bands then had exposure, and the Dusty Springfields and the Lulus and the Manfred Mann bands, and of course the Beatles were well established, but they didn't mind a bit of exposure either. The Rolling Stones, the Who, just go through the whole Musi bands, and they were absolutely over the moon by the whole thing. And from then on, it just grew and grew, and where record companies and publishers shunned us initially, suddenly there were brown paper bags arriving on the doorstep. One particular one was the publisher rang. I happened to pick up the phone in the office, and he said, I have a new artist. He's rather good looking. I'll send his photo. His new record is just released. Well, it will be released very shortly. It's a biog on him. You might like to have a listen. Okay, send it around. It was Tom Jones.
It's not unusual to be loved by anyone. It's not unusual to have fun with anyone. When I see
And It's Not Unusual was played every hour on the hour for a week. And of course it just went straight to number one. And then various artists want to come out to the ship, because I was also interested in it. Mick Jagger was a huge fan, and so was the Who. So if any of them wanted to come out, we'd arrange it, and they'd come out on the tender and board the ship, and we would have a Manfred Mann Day or the Who Day, whoever wanted to be there, and every third or fourth record would be one of theirs, and they would be chatting away on air. The freedom of being able to program spontaneously was fantastic. The sponsors were very varied, and one that came on board was the Egg Board, which was a government-run department, and our marketing department came up with Go to Work on an Egg. It was an enormous success. Egg sales skyrocketed, and then the BBC complained, and because it was a government department, the Egg Board was a government department, they pulled the advertising. That's how petty the whole thing became, and they were furious, absolutely livid, that we were actually advertising a government department when really the whole setup was illegal. We used to pinch things from the BBC like their news. We didn't have a news service, as you can imagine. A bit hard to do when you're in the middle of the sea. So we would tape the 12 noon news and edit it down to a minute and a half, and whoever was on air at the time would broadcast it. We did that for 2 or 3 years. So the BBC unwittingly supplied us with the worldwide resources of the BBC. I wondered how the heck did we get all that information? We did move the ship one time. We moved the southern ship. The management in their wisdom decided that a different location may give a better signal. So off they trundled out somewhere further in the North Sea, and instead of a 40-minute trip from Harwich Pier in a tender to get on board Caroline, it became 5 hours. But the first time I went out to the new location, a force-8 gale came up, and we came alongside Caroline, and really it was quite dangerous because you had to jump from one ship to the other. And the captain said, I don't think so. And Dorothy and I said, well, we can't go back. Not another 5 hours of this. It's just too much. So they threw us over the side. And we were caught by the big Dutch chef, Arnold, who was enormous. And he managed to catch both of us, and we stayed on board for 3 weeks. We could not get off. The conditions were so bad. The guys were seasick, racing up and down, giving them seasick tablets all the time. Records were falling off shelves. The on-air presentation was dreadful because the needle would slip across the vinyls. And we had a little system which was called Half Crown Day. If the weather was rough, you'd put an English half crown on top of the needle on the turnstile, and that would weight down the needle on the record and hold it there, and it worked. So half-crown days were quite frequent in those situations. We both got letters of commendation from the management. We didn't really have much alternative. You couldn't get off. Stuck. But the ship did catch fire in that location, and the mast caught fire, the 300-foot mast, and guys were running around with fire extinguishers, a bit of panic on board. We may have to abandon ship. And I thought, oh, not in the middle of the North Sea, please. Anyhow, they got it under control, and we trundled on back to our old location. So things settled down again, and we just continued on our merry little way. I worked with Tony Withers at 2UE, and then he went to 2GB. The newspaper article came out that he was very ill, he was dying, and he's going back to Greece. Well, somewhere between Australia and Athens, he made a miraculous recovery. And he joined Radio Caroline in London. And he was invaluable, really, because of experience in his DJ work in Australia. He did have a tendency to have a bottle of Coke by his side. One of his major sponsors in Australia was Coca-Cola. And it was always heavily laced with gin. So the bottle of Coke remained by his side on board Radio Caroline, where alcohol was banned, by the way. So as the program went on and on, through an hour or so, things became much more relaxed and interesting as the bottle of Coke emptied. The movie The Boat That Rocked was made by an American company that did Four Weddings and a Funeral, and which are very high-powered movies, was a tribute to pirate radio, and radio in Caroline in particular. They didn't call it Caroline, but that was what it was. They got the music right, but the story itself was really not right. No mention of any Australians. They had a token New Zealander, and we didn't have a New Zealander on board. It was mainly Australians and Canadians, with a few Englishmen thrown in. Simon D was the Canadian disc jockey who went on to very big things. Tony Blackman was an English disc jockey who used to work in a nightclub, and he was trained by Tony Withers, and he, after he left Caroline, was England's #1 DJ. When I returned to 2SM, it was still good guys, and it was Bob Rogers, Mike Walsh, Tony Murphy, Phil Haldeman, John Mahon, names that perhaps some people may remember there, but Bob Rogers is still on air at 2CH. He's in his 80s. He's still doing 5 days a week. It's just incredible, and loves every minute of it. Wouldn't do anything else. Some of the others have passed on to other places. But it's amazing that the stamina that these people have for the radio industry. And even though some of them have put their toe in the water to television, they've always gone back. Not many of them stayed in television. They have always gone back to their first love, and that's radio. And I think that's indicative of the changing face of radio. It's really wonderful. You can move with the times. So that's really about it.